So it is free to choose Friday today, and we are focusing in on the Supreme Court and its impact on American liberty. In the last segment, we talked with a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation to break down a number of cases, and the final case that we delved into was the one called McGirt v. Oklahoma, and we will get to that momentarily with Keith Nobles, who is good friend of the program. He is author of the novel Our Dogs Did Not Bark, a politically incorrect dystopian tale. Keith is also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and has some excellent insights to share momentarily in McGirt v. Oklahoma. And Keith Nobles joins us now here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Keith, welcome back to the show, my friend. Good to have you here.
Good to be back. How are you?
You know, I'm doing pretty well. Happy Free to Choose Friday.
Happy Free to Choose Friday.
Now, I have to show something. So, first of all, Nathan Matoush, put up Keith on the full screen, please. No lower third. Let's get a look at the T-shirt that he is wearing. Not yet at peak absurdity. And not only that, put up the picture, please. We have these T-shirts available for you at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com. Right there, you can see we've got men's shirts, women's shirts. We've got the camper mug as well. And it is in reference to something that Keith in our circles is pretty famous for. This idea that is, you're often asked a question, Keith, are we at peak absurdity yet? And your answer,
No,
of course, is
no, we're not.
Not
yet. Peak absurdity.
Exactly right. Tell us about that for just a moment so people can have a little bit of context for the product available at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com.
Well, James Kunstler, the novelist and blogger, a little more than 4 years ago, February of 2016, I believe, posted a phrase that I reused a lot. That sometimes societies just collectively go insane.
Right.
And part of that insanity is the continued absurdity we see in public life. You don't have to stray any farther than Twitter or Facebook or any of the social media platforms to see it every day. We continually become more absurd. We are continually more detached from reason, from sanity, from what makes sense. And it's been kind of a competition. People for about 4 years have been asking me, are we at peak absurdity yet? And I keep saying, no, we are not. But 2020 may be the year we hit peak absurdity. Let's hope this is the year. Let's hope it doesn't get more absurd than it will be by the end of this year.
So in other words, what you're suggesting, Keith Nobles, is that these T-shirts, not yet at peak absurdity, by the way, saying Keith Nobles, referencing you there, that they may have a shelf life.
Oh, yeah.
Or should we say a dresser drawer life? All right. Well, I hope not. I hope they could. Well, actually, I hope so. For our society, for our sanity, I certainly hope that eventually we reach peak absurdity. Once again, Keith Nobles, our guest, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Check out his novel, Our Dogs Did Not Bark, a politically incorrect dystopian tale. All right, Keith. McGirt v. Oklahoma. You are a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, so you have a strong interest in this. I know you've been to Oklahoma many times. I want to ask you right off the bat to set the table for us before we get into any opinions and some of the implications. Set the table for us on this decision and what it entails. And I know that this goes back to really gives, a couple hundred years of history in the mix.
Yeah, and as you know, I've spoken and written about this very issue for a very long time. So roll back to the Constitution being adopted, roll back to George Washington being the first president. The parts here of the Constitution that are relevant to this case, to this matter, are Article 1, which is the sovereignty of the nations, that Indian nations should be self-governing under the Constitution, and Article 6, which are treaties are the law of the land. So these are the guardrails. George Washington, being the first president, had the first Indian policy, and that Indian policy was he invited Indians into the family. He invited Indians in to become Americans. this is very important. So, as a Cherokee, the Cherokee Nation, we were the first tribe to accept this offer. We sent Major Ridge, a prominent Cherokee, to the White House in 1807, and he told Thomas Jefferson, "We accept your offer to become Americans." And from that point on, Cherokees clung to being Americans. So, this offer extended through the early presidencies, the early administrations, for Indians to become Americans, and this was the American policy. Andrew Jackson revoked that policy, revoked that offer. This is why Indians do not like Andrew Jackson, because Andrew Jackson basically said, "I take the offer to become Americans off the table. You cannot be Americans. You can never be Americans," was essentially the message. Okay, so from this point, we deviated from the Constitution in regard to Indians. And it was one bad idea replacing the unintended consequences of the previous bad idea. Well, the relevant piece of this decision yesterday goes back to the Curtis Act that was passed in 1898. And what they tried to do, essentially the Curtis Act tried to abolish Indians as a legal status. That was the essence of it. And in doing that, it basically destroyed tribal governments, the ability to govern yourselves, et cetera, et cetera. What happened yesterday was the Supreme Court ruling that essentially the remnants of that law were unconstitutional. I mean, that's the essence of it. So some of the Curtis Act had been rolled back by Richard Nixon, thankfully. Some of it was rolled back in previous court cases like Harjo v. Kleppe. But yeah, what happened yesterday was significant. It was something I never thought I would see in my life. It was a Supreme Court Justice, Gorsuch, looking at the Constitution, taking it at its word, Article 1 and Article 6, looking at the treaty that was signed, and taking the treaty as word and saying, well, this is what it is. There's no fooling around here. There's no trying to mitigate what it is. And so it was very much a return to the Constitution. We have not seen that in a very, very long time.
Now, Keith, what do you make, though, of the fact that it was Gorsuch aligned with the four liberals on the bench, and you have Clarence Thomas, Justice Alito, Justice Kavanaugh, and Chief Justice Roberts all aligned in opposition and dissenting from this particular decision? Because it was 5-4, but it was interesting lines drawn in terms of the ideological makeup, and you normally would find certainly Justice Thomas on the side of the Constitution. So what makes you think that they were wrong?
Well, so I can tell you here. I think the four justices who sided with Gorsuch probably did the right thing for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. But this is really interesting. And this is what was, I wrote about this at some length when Gorsuch was nominated to the court. Gorsuch understands Indian law. He's well versed in Indian law. He is probably the best versed justice in Indian law that the Supreme Court has seen since the Marshall Court 180 years ago, 190 years ago. Justice Scalia, who I have tremendous respect for, Justice Scalia once said, when it comes to Indian law, we're just making it up as we go. This is, if you're an Indian, this is obviously a very important thing. For 98% of Americans, it's trivial. It's not important to them at all. And really, why should it be? It's not something they deal with or think of. And so from a point of view of judges, there are very few judges who are versed in Indian law, very few judges on the federal bench who have any experience in Indian law. Gorsuch, fortunately, is one of the very few, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court. What Gorsuch did was follow the Constitution, and hats off to him for that. Understanding the intricacies here of what are 190 years of horrible federal policy in regard to Indians and voiding the Constitution. And he took the step back to say, we're going to follow the Constitution here. Whereas John Roberts took a more practical view of, well, these are all the bad things or unintended consequences that could happen from this decision. Gorsuch said, this is what the Constitution says. This is what the treaty says. There's no ambiguity here. This is what we'll do.
Again, Keith Noble's our guest, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads once again. So let's talk about some of the implications of this decision. What does this mean? I mean, as we were talking about with our previous guest, Zach Smith of the Heritage Foundation, legal fellow there, this is particularly narrowly tailored towards criminal law and enforcing criminal laws on the Indian territory and the Indian reservation land that now is about half of Oklahoma under this ruling. So, what do you view as the implications of this from a practical standpoint, from specifically what this ruling is about? And then we'll get to some of the implications moving forward.
Okay, so it's even narrower than that, Jimmy. In that it only applies to the 5 tribes. So as I mentioned before, George Washington invited Indian nations in to become Americans. Well, before Andrew Jackson revoked that decision, there were 5 nations that accepted that offer. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Creek, who are Muskogee Indians. The 5 tribes. So those 5 tribes are the only people that this decision applies to. There's 39 Indian nations just in Oklahoma. There's nearly 600 throughout the nation. It only applies to those 5 tribes. So it's even narrower than just law enforcement. It's law enforcement for those 5 tribes. But here's what's important, I think. There's a lot of almost hyperbole about what could change here. In practicality, I think very little is going to change. What has happened here since 1907 is that the state has been able to dictate these matters to the 5 tribes. Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek. What this decision does is it removes the ability of the state to have to be able to dictate law enforcement matters to these nations. It requires the state and the nations to sit down and negotiate what they're going to do. And so it's a wonderful thing that there'll be cooperation here where there was not cooperation before. And that's a good thing for everyone all the way around. Now, I don't think in practical terms, anything's really going to change here in terms of law enforcement. So, and you're into things that most people have no experience with. But for these 5 Indian nations, they have tribal law enforcement. There is also within their territory state law enforcement, state police, and then there's local law enforcement for the cities and the counties. Generally speaking, the state, local, and tribal law enforcement, they're already all cross-badged. They're already all cooperating on that level. The only thing here that could change would be the judicial system, and it's highly unlikely that is going to change much. It is probable the tribes will accede to the local courts and the state court continuing to prosecute these cases. But the thing is, they have a voice here. What's been returned to them that the Curtis Act took away is their ability to say no. They have now the ability to say no if they want to.
So you're suggesting here, Keith Nobles, that the practical impact of this decision, in accordance with what it actually addresses, isn't going to be significant in terms of day-to-day life changes, but what's significant is how Indians will be treated in terms of their relation with the states and the federal government.
Yes, the Indian nations and the state government will have to cooperate now. And where for 113 years they were dictated to. That's the major difference here. That's the improvement in the situation. I mean, that's a major thing. That's a major turnabout in the history of Indian relationships between state and federal government and the Indian nations.
What is the feeling, the sense then for your fellow Cherokee and others of the 5 nations that are particularly impacted by this decision? Is there great enthusiasm?
Oh, people are ecstatic. People are thrilled. We can have a voice in our affairs that we never had before. And even if what the agreement that we make comes to is nearly identical to what it is now, that's not the point. The point is it's cooperation. It's voluntarily reaching an agreement, not being dictated to. And that makes people very, very happy.
So, Keith Nobles, let me ask you a final question then here for every American who's watching this with intrigue about this changing dynamic here. How does this impact liberty on this Free to Choose Friday? What's notable about this decision in that context, in your view, especially as both an American citizen and a Cherokee citizen?
So we're returning closer to the Constitution of the Indian nations being self-governing. And people tend to be almost hyperbolic that they're going to go off and do things, wild, crazy things with that self-governance. And that's highly unlikely to be what happens. What is going to happen is we'll see a greater degree of cooperation here between tribal governments, state governments, local governments. That is what is going to happen. A lot of the hyperbole is just uncalled for, in my opinion. We are going to see greater cooperation, and as a result of that, what we'll see is local people having a greater voice in how they are governed. I also want to say there's a lot of concerns I hear people mention about land ownership and various things, and the majority of people who live on these tribal lands at this point are not Cherokee, Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, Chickasaw at this point. And we have all lived quite well with our non-Indian neighbors in these territories for a very long time. And so I just don't see any issues there. That's not going to change. What changes here is a greater degree of cooperation between government entities. I think a lot of the concerns are probably uncalled for, as well as your previous guest mentioned maybe 2,000 cases have to be reheard. The Indian nations have voiced a desire that the people who have already been convicted of crimes need to face the justice they've already been sentenced to. So there's no cry here from the Indian nations to release any of these people. Many of these people, like McGirt, was convicted of a horrible crime. And the sense is he needs to serve his sentence, which is like 500 years for this horrible crime. So the idea here that Indians will argue these people should be freed is that's just not valid.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your insights today here, Keith Nobles. Very fascinating perspective that at least in my circles, you're the only one who could really provide that kind of perspective, and I really appreciate it. It is a unique part of American history, also a very sordid part of American history, to be sure, but unique in terms of the dynamics and the relationships and how this has evolved over time and now where we are at this point in 2020. So I appreciate you joining us in that regard.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jimmy.
And before we let you go, let's put up on the screen one more time what people can get at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com. Your very own, not yet at peak absurdity, Keith Nobles t-shirt and the camper mug as well. Shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com. Keith Nobles, model it for us one more time, my friend. There you go. Keith Nobles, everybody, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Check out the shirt. Thanks for joining us, and happy Free to Choose Friday, my friend.
Happy Free to Choose Friday.
Thank you. Be sure to check it out. A number of other great things at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads as well. Some other fantastic t-shirts, mugs, a mouse pad for Eternal Vigilance is the Price of Liberty, Thomas Jefferson, and the list goes on. Still Proud throw pillow and tote bag and t-shirt and more. Check it all out at shop.jimmyatthecrossroads.com. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.